3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells. 1 minute, 15 seconds, velocity 29.
They lifted off chasing Triumph, but 73 seconds later, Challenger vanished. When divers began retrieving debris from the ocean floor, what emerged wasn't just shattered metal. It was evidence that forced officials to confront questions no one was prepared for. Now, we reveal what the sea tried to bury.
A piece of the Challenger space shuttle has been discovered. This piece was found, by divers.
Beneath the waves, the truth lingered in broken pieces. Divers pushed through icy darkness, finding warped steel, burned fragments, and something far more unsettling. Each fragment raised new revelations about those final moments, and the deeper the search went, the more disturbing the story grew. When Triumph turned into silence, the launch that changed America. For as long as humanity has looked up at the stars, we've believed space exploration was the closest thing we had to touching the impossible. And on the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of Americans gathered to witness what they thought would be another proud leap into that frontier. Schools rolled televisions into classrooms, news anchors braced themselves for a historic broadcast, and families huddled around living room screens. This wasn't just any launch. This was Challenger, carrying not only scientists and astronauts, but a school teacher whose presence had turned an ordinary mission into a national celebration. The 1986 mission was more than routine. It was symbolic. Politically, it stood as proof that America's space program was still bold, ambitious, and very much alive. Scientifically, it promised experiments, satellite deployment, and a chance to observe Halley's Comet from orbit. And culturally, well, it had something no mission before it ever had: Christa McAuliffe. She wasn't just joining the crew, she was carrying the hopes of millions of students who suddenly felt that space wasn't reserved for scientists in lab coats. If a teacher could go, maybe one day they could too.
Good morning, this is Christa McAuliffe, live from the Challenger, and I'm going to be taking you through a field trip.
That sense of national pride electrified the air across the country. Classroom cheers, reporters speaking with wide smiles, teachers telling their students, "Watch closely, history is about to happen." And at Kennedy Space Center, the families of the 7 crew members stood bundled against the cold, hearts pounding with a mix of fear, pride, and anticipation. Each astronaut had their own path to the launch pad, each carrying a lifetime of work, skill, and courage. Francis Scobie, the commander, was the calm center of the storm, steady, focused, the kind of leader you'd follow into the unknown without hesitation. Michael Smith, the pilot, was precise, disciplined, and unshakably reliable, the kind of man who solved problems before they became problems. Judith Resnick, with her brilliant engineering mind, had a reputation for solving complex challenges with almost frightening ease. Ellison Onizuka, an Air Force officer, carried a quiet determination forged through years of military training and perseverance. Ronald McNair, a physicist and musician, felt equally at home in a lab or on a stage, his intellect matched only by his creativity. Gregory Jarvis, the payload specialist, brought expertise from Hughes Aircraft, ready to conduct experiments that could push scientific understanding forward. And then there was Christa McAuliffe, the teacher whose smile had charmed the entire nation. She wasn't there as a passenger. She was there to teach lessons from orbit, to inspire, to prove that space belonged to everyone. 7 individuals with 7 different journeys, united by one shared dream, the pursuit of discovery. But even dreams come with warnings. That morning, Florida was colder than usual, record-low temperatures that left icicles dangling from the launch pad. Engineers expressed concern. Some even urged NASA to delay the launch. But schedules, pressure, and technical debates drowned out caution. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The roar of the engines rolled over the marshes as flames surged beneath the shuttle. Challenger rose slowly at first, then climbed with confidence into the flawless blue sky. A long white plume stretched behind it, curling like a comet's tail. For 73 seconds, everything looked perfect. Inside classrooms across America, kids cheered. Teachers smiled. News broadcasters nodded proudly. And on the Florida coast, the astronauts' families watched the shuttle shrink into the sky, hearts swelling with hope. It felt like one of those moments people would talk about for decades, bragging about their presence the day that the Challenger was launched. And then, in an instant, the story changed. At 11:39 a.m., a sudden flash cut across the sky. The shuttle seemed to twist unnaturally before bursting into a massive branching cloud of fire and smoke. White trails split away in different directions, curling downward like broken tendrils. People stared, unblinking, not fully processing what they were seeing. It didn't look like the explosions you see in action movies. It didn't look like anything anyone expected at all. Mission Control fell into stunned silence. Voices shifted from routine callouts to shaky uncertainty. Finally, Flight Director Jay Green gave the words that confirmed everyone's fear. Obviously a major malfunction. Families on the viewing platform clutched each other. Some cried. Some whispered that maybe this was part of the mission. Some unexpected maneuver. But deep down, they knew. Everyone knew. And Challenger, so full of promise just moments earlier, was gone. Across the United States, the same thing happened. Silence. Classrooms that had erupted with cheers now sat frozen. Teachers struggled to say something, anything to explain what students had just seen live. News anchors, usually composed and articulate, fumbled for words. Their voices cracked, their scripts abandoned.
Usually the night before, I had the same nightmare that what I saw today, and I thought it was a dream. I was speechless for a few minutes. I knew that explosion shouldn't have happened when it did.
NASA plunged into emergency protocol mode. Phones rang nonstop. Engineers frantically reviewed data. No one knew the fate of the crew, though many feared the worst. There were no parachutes, no escape systems, no signals, no debris large enough to suggest intact survival. Meanwhile, the Atlantic was littered with smoke and scattered fragments. Coast Guard boats sped toward the debris field. Navy ships scrambled. Helicopters hovered low, kicking up spray as they searched for any sign of life. For a brief moment, one filled with desperate hope, people clung to the possibility that somehow, impossibly, the crew had survived. But the truth was waiting beneath the waves, and while the world tried to make sense of what it had just witnessed, rescue teams raced toward the Atlantic. Unaware that they weren't beginning a rescue at all, they were stepping into one of the most complex, heartbreaking recovery missions in NASA's history. The ocean search that became a sobering recovery operation. In the hours after the explosion, the Atlantic Ocean became the center of the nation's grief. What began as a desperate search for survivors would soon transform into one of the most complex and emotionally draining recovery operations in NASA's history. And for the teams sent out to the crash site, the ocean wasn't just cold and unforgiving. It was holding secrets no one was ready to face. The moment Challenger disappeared into that cloud of fire, alarms rang across the eastern seaboard. Coast Guard cutters launched almost instantly, slicing through the waves toward the debris zone. Navy ships scrambled from nearby bases, their crews still unsure what they were racing toward. At first, hope was the anchor. Maybe there were survivors. Maybe the cabin had splashed down. Maybe someone was floating on a raft, waiting to be found. For a few fragile hours, the belief that rescue was still possible kept everyone moving at a frantic pace. But the ocean had its own language. Choppy waves, freezing winds, and debris scattered across miles of open water. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights sweeping across floating insulation, twisted metal, and pieces of the solid rocket booster. Life rafts were spotted, but they were empty. The only sounds were rotors beating the air and waves slapping against hulls. With each hour that passed, the optimism that had launched the search began to thin out. The debris they were finding wasn't the kind that suggested survival. The ocean was spelling the truth in pieces. By late afternoon, NASA delivered the confirmation no one wanted. There were no survivors. The mission shifted instantly. Rescue turned into recovery. The debris field was massive, stretching wider than anyone expected. And while officials tried to stay composed, the media swarmed every shoreline, every press briefing, every whisper of information. The country wanted answers. NASA wanted answers. But the Atlantic wasn't giving anything up easily. Within days, a massive multi-agency task force was formed, one of the largest peacetime ocean recovery operations ever attempted. Navy sonar teams scanned the seafloor, building ghostly maps of what lay below. Air Force crews flew systematic grid patterns, photographing every ripple and every shimmer of metal. NOAA specialists studied currents to predict where debris might drift. Civilian divers and contractors joined the effort, bringing expertise from deep-sea engineering and offshore operations. At its peak, thousands of people were involved, all united under a single mission: bring Challenger home, piece by piece. Even seasoned divers admitted the work carried a weight unlike anything they'd experienced. The ocean, usually loud with life, felt eerily silent. Every descent came with the knowledge that they weren't just searching for wreckage. They were searching for the remains of 7 human beings who had chased a dream into the sky. Some divers later said the silence underwater was almost harder to bear than what they found. At first, the teams went out believing someone might still be alive. They scanned every ripple of the cold Atlantic, hoping a flare or beacon would break through the waves. But as the first full day passed, the truth settled, like the fog rolling across the water. The debris didn't lie. The explosion hadn't just damaged the orbiter, it had torn it apart at nearly 50,000 feet. NASA's announcement ended the hope, but it didn't end the mission. Now the ocean had to be studied like a crime scene. The Rogers Commission would later detail just how monumental this task became. NASA created the Search, Recovery, and Reconstruction Task Force, a massive collaboration of military, federal, and civilian teams. Navy sonar painted the ocean floor with grainy outlines of metal. Air Force aircraft tracked debris on the surface. Divers dropped into dark, icy depths, often returning with fragments that hinted at the violence of those final moments. Within weeks, the debris field spanned hundreds of square miles. Thousands of pieces were brought up and laid out in Hangar AE at Kennedy Space Center like a heartbreaking jigsaw puzzle. Each twisted beam, each scorched panel helped investigators retrace the final 73 seconds. Yet one question loomed above all others. Where was the crew cabin? NASA workers felt the weight of that question every day. Engineers who had designed the shuttle stared at fragments of their own creation. Mechanics who had touched the orbiter with their own hands watched its pieces arrive on flatbeds. Controllers who had seen the data vanish from their screens took the silence personally. By April, more than 100 tons of debris had been recovered, nearly half the shuttle's original mass. The rest remained swallowed by the Atlantic. The Rogers Commission documented every detail, but what it couldn't measure was the emotional toll. For the families of Scobie, Smith, Onizuka, Resnick, McNair, Jarvis, and McAuliffe, each recovered fragment brought both heartbreak and closure. Challenger's loss became more than a disaster. It became a turning point. NASA's culture changed, but one discovery would shake even the most seasoned divers. Divers didn't realize they were looking at the crew cabin until an astronaut's flight suit floated up from the mangled debris 87 feet down. Mike McAllister, one of the divers, later said the sight hit him like a bomb going off in an airplane. Nothing looked familiar, nothing looked survivable. He and his partner Terry Bailey had just minutes of air left. They saw the suit pinned under wreckage, its legs floating upward as if someone might still be inside. McAllister knew flight suits weren't worn during launch, but they were stored in the cabin. He and Bailey exchanged a look neither ever forgot. They had found what everyone had been searching for. They marked the location with a buoy and surfaced. Navy divers from the USS Preserver returned later and raised the cabin. For the recovery teams, finding it felt like bringing home soldiers long missing, like retrieving a pilot from a war 15 years too late. It didn't erase the pain, but it finally closed the gap between hope and truth. But even as the cabin was brought to the surface, the ocean still held more answers. The debris that followed didn't just show destruction, it revealed piece by piece exactly what happened in Challenger's final seconds. Reconstructing a disaster, what investigators found beneath the waves. When the first fragments of Challenger were brought up from the Atlantic, no one could have predicted how much those battered pieces would reveal. Each twisted beam, each scorched panel, each instrument that somehow survived the impact, they were more than debris. They were pages of a story waiting to be read, a story investigators would rebuild shard by shard until the final seconds of the shuttle's life came into painful clarity. And as the pieces surfaced, so did the truth. Recovery teams began hauling up metal so warped it looked like it had been peeled back by giant hands. Burnt insulation clung to the edges like blackened feathers. Scorched panels, some cracked, some folded, arrived coated in salt water and silence. Shockingly, a few instruments were still intact, their numbers frozen exactly where they had been when everything went wrong. These weren't just parts of a spacecraft, they were clues, and the forensic teams waiting on shore knew it. Inside hangars lit by harsh white lamps, investigators worked the way archaeologists might work an ancient catastrophe, carefully, methodically, with the weight of history pressing against their shoulders. Telemetry data was compared second by second against the timeline of the launch. Engineers replayed broadcast footage in extreme slow motion, zooming in so close the grain of the video began to break apart. They studied fracture patterns, burn trails, and warped joints, trying to understand not just what broke, but when and why. Expert teams worked around the clock, scribbling notes, arguing over details, and piecing together a reconstruction that felt both technical and deeply human. Somewhere in those fragments was the answer. At the center of it all was a small, unassuming piece of rubber, the O-ring. In theory, its job was simple: seal the joint of the right solid rocket booster. In practice, it was the thin line between success and disaster. That morning, the freezing temperatures turned the rubber stiff, robbing it of the flexibility it needed to press tightly against the metal. The moment Challenger lifted off, the O-ring was never fully sealed. A thin, bright flame slipped through the joint like a knife. It burned straight into the external fuel tank, carving a hole deeper and deeper with every passing second. What followed was not a Hollywood-style explosion. It was a structural collapse. The external tank ruptured, the orbiter veered violently, and aerodynamic forces shredded the shuttle apart in midair. The investigators weren't just identifying a failure. They were uncovering a flaw people had warned about for years. The breakup itself was brutal, but not in the way the public assumed. Challenger didn't blow up in the fireball seen on television. That orange bloom was the fuel igniting after the structure failed. The shuttle itself was torn apart by forces it was never built to endure. Astonishingly, the crew cabin held together. While the rest of the orbiter fragmented, the cabin broke free in one piece and continued to rise on its original trajectory. For a brief moment, it climbed through the sky without wings, without engines, without anything except momentum. Then gravity took over. The cabin arced upward, then began its fall. Nearly 2 minutes of silent, ballistic descent toward the ocean. At roughly 200 meters per hour, the impact was catastrophic. Investigators believe the crew likely lost consciousness early due to rapid depressurization, a small mercy in an otherwise unbearable sequence of events. But one detail left everyone shaken. Several of the crew's personal egress air packs had been manually activated. Someone, perhaps multiple people, had been alive long enough to reach for oxygen. Reports later revealed that the 7 astronauts aboard Challenger may have remained conscious for at least 10 long seconds after the shuttle broke apart. In those final moments, at least 3 of them activated their emergency air packs, silent evidence that the crew fought to survive, even as the world watched the unthinkable unfold. At a press briefing, NASA officials revealed evidence suggesting the Challenger crew not only survived the initial breakup, but were alert enough to grasp the danger and activate their emergency air systems. It was a revelation that added a heartbreaking layer to an already tragic story. The findings released later from the recovered crew cabin, along with a transcript of the final moments inside the compartment, directly challenged NASA's earlier announcement, which had suggested the astronauts were unaware of what was happening. But a deeper analysis of the internal recordings revealed something different. Investigators detected what they called the first potential indication of awareness. It came in a single, haunting phrase. "Uh-oh," pilot Michael J. Smith said, just 73 seconds after liftoff. It was the final sound captured by the cabin intercom before both the internal system and the air-to-ground communications were cut off at the moment the shuttle broke apart. It's my belief that, in that instant, the commander and pilot knew something had gone terribly wrong, said Rear Admiral Richard H. Truly, NASA's Associate Administrator for Spaceflight. That was the moment the shuttle came apart. The restored audio tapes captured only the voices of the 4 astronauts on the flight deck: Commander Francis R. Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, and mission specialists Ellison S. Onizuka and Judith A. Resnick, locked in those final seconds of awareness as the disaster unfolded around them. Unlike the flight deck's voice-activated intercom, the mid-deck system only captured audio when a crew member pressed a button. Sharon Krista McAuliffe, Ronald E. McNair, and Gregory B. Jarvis, seated on the mid-deck, never activated it, following standard NASA procedure. Their voices weren't recorded, but officials confirmed they could still hear everything being said above them, listening in as the final moments unfolded. It didn't change the outcome, but it changed everything about how investigators viewed those final seconds. The truth was far more chilling than the footage the public had seen. As investigators pieced together the timeline, recovery operations intensified. Using sonar sweeps, dive grids, and underwater submersibles, Navy and Air Force teams began zeroing in on the deeper fragments, including the one piece everyone feared finding: the crew cabin. On March 7th, divers finally located it, resting roughly 100 feet down. Even the most seasoned among them later admitted they recognized the gravity instantly. The debris didn't look like machinery anymore. It looked like a place where people had once lived, worked, and laughed. When the cabin was lifted onto the recovery ships, the deck fell silent. Engineers, military personnel, and forensic experts stood shoulder to shoulder, knowing they were holding the shuttle's final chapter in front of them. Handling the debris felt almost ceremonial, like honoring a grave. Inside the hangar, the reconstruction transformed into something monumental. Investigators built a skeletal outline of Challenger, filling it with the recovered fragments one by one. The right booster joint, where the O-ring failed, became the centerpiece of analysis. Burn patterns told a story more clearly than any report could. The Rogers Commission would later call this reconstruction essential, a turning point in understanding not just what broke, but why no one had stopped it. And as investigators reached the final pages of their analysis, one question grew heavier. Had the crew been recovered, and what had they endured? Official reports were cautious, sensitive, measured. But behind closed doors, the truth was quietly acknowledged. Yes, remains had been found. Yes, they had been handled with dignity. And yes, the ocean had taken a devastating toll. But if the physics of the breakup were devastating, what divers found next carried a weight far heavier than twisted metal, a reminder of the human cost hidden beneath the waves. The crew cabin, the human remains, and the legacy left behind. The Challenger breakup lasted only moments, but the aftermath stretched for months. Months spent scanning the ocean, listening to sonar echoes, and descending into darkness to find the truth. The shuttle had scattered across a vast section of the Atlantic, but investigators were searching for one thing above all others: the crew cabin. Everyone knew that whatever answers remained would be found there, resting quietly beneath miles of water. It was sonar that finally caught the first clue. A dense, oddly shaped return appeared on a screen inside a recovery vessel, just enough to stop the room. Divers geared up, expecting more broken metal, but prepared for the possibility of something far heavier. The descent was unsettling. The ocean was cold, dark, and strangely silent at that depth. As the divers' lights cut through the murk, the silhouette emerged piece by piece. Curved structure, shattered panels, tangled wiring, and then the full outline became clear. The crew cabin. It sat on the seabed like a silent tomb, partly collapsed, partly intact, eerily preserved in the stillness. Nothing about it looked peaceful, yet the stillness around it created an almost reverent quiet. The divers later said that reaching the cabin felt like stepping into the final breath of the mission. They knew instantly, this was the heart of the investigation. And it was also the heaviest burden. But it wasn't just equipment down there. Official reports would later use the most careful wording possible: possible human remains. The truth was delicate, fragmented, commingled, and heartbreaking. Nothing was intact. Nothing resembled what the public might imagine. The ocean had carried out its own terrible process: salt, pressure, time, until only small, fragile fragments remained. Dr. Joseph P. Kerwin, NASA's Director of Life Sciences at Johnson Space Center, explained that the explosion separating the crew cabin from the rest of Challenger likely didn't kill or even seriously injure the astronauts. Medical analysis tells us the forces they experienced were survivable, Kerwin wrote in a report to Rear Admiral Richard Truly. The odds of major injury were low. What happened next, however, is far more uncertain. Kerwin noted that the crew may have lost consciousness within seconds as the cabin began to depressurize, but how quickly that happened depended entirely on the size of the breach, something impossible to determine from the wreckage. The cabin shot upward to 65,000 feet after the breakup, where the air was so thin that even with emergency oxygen, useful consciousness would last only 6 to 15 seconds. Their descent, however, was long. 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the explosion, the intact cabin slammed into the ocean at roughly 207 miles per hour, a force no one inside could survive. Medical examiners later confirmed they couldn't determine the exact cause of death, nor whether the crew had suffered oxygen loss while still in flight. Each astronaut had access to a 5-minute emergency air pack, but the devices had to be activated by hand. Commander Scobie and pilot Michael Smith couldn't reach theirs without leaving their seats. And when the wreckage was recovered, investigators found that every crew member was still strapped in, frozen in the positions they had held as Challenger made its final fall toward the sea. The divers didn't treat the cabin like wreckage anymore. From that moment on, it became a place of recovery, not salvage. Every movement slowed. Every action was deliberate. One diver later described the atmosphere perfectly. It stopped feeling like a mission. It started feeling like a vigil. The breakup forces had been extraordinary, far beyond what any human body could survive. The crew cabin separated intact, but what followed was an instant, violent sequence: extreme deceleration, depressurization, and then the fall. What remained afterward endured weeks of saltwater deterioration, pressure, and fragmentation. By the time the remains were recovered, individual identification was nearly impossible. And it was 1986, long before DNA matching became common practice. Investigators relied on anatomical clues and personal artifacts, but even those methods had limits. Once remains were confirmed, the mission shifted into strict military protocol. Pathologists and forensic specialists were flown in to handle every step: documentation, preservation, and transport. Each fragment was cataloged with care. Nothing was shown publicly, photographed for release, or described in detail. NASA made a deliberate choice to protect the families. The loss had already unfolded before the entire world. There was no need to expose the most private, painful realities. The Rogers Commission later confirmed recovery of remains, but only in brief, respectful sentences. The agency maintained silence, not secrecy, just dignity. When the recovery concluded, NASA followed the wishes of each family. Identifiable remains were returned privately. The commingled remains, those that could not be separated, were cremated together. On May 20, 1986, those shared remains were laid to rest with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. It was a quiet day, the kind of ceremony where the silence says everything words can't. Astronauts stood shoulder to shoulder, families gathered close. The flag was folded, handed gently from one pair of hands to another. The monument that stands there today bears 7 names, white stone, black letters, a tribute not to how they died, but to how they lived. NASA never released photos or explicit forensic information. The agency chose respect, something the families and the nation needed more than spectacle. But the mission didn't end with grief. It marked the beginning of transformation. The recovered cabin and debris allowed investigators to piece together the final seconds with precision. Those findings revealed the vulnerabilities that had been overlooked. O-ring failures, miscommunications, pressure to launch, safety warnings ignored for the sake of staying on schedule. NASA realized it wasn't just a technical failure, it was a cultural one. The people closest to the recovery rarely forget what they saw. Divers spoke of the ghost-like stillness of the ocean floor, the way the cabin rested like a monument to everything the crew had hoped to achieve. Engineers remembered working with grief, sitting beside them like an uninvited partner, yet still needing to maintain perfect precision. To them, the mission never felt purely technical, it felt human. One engineer said the work became a way to carry the crew home. Another said every piece of metal they lifted felt like a message from the sky. Remember what happened and never let it happen again. When the Rogers Commission published its findings, the section on recovery was brief but powerful. It acknowledged the human remains with respect and documented the enormous efforts of the Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, NOAA, and civilian teams who retrieved nearly half of Challenger's structure. The remaining fragments, along with the cabin, were sealed in a private room at Kennedy Space Center, accessible only to authorized officials. They are revisited occasionally, not for spectacle, but for lessons. Some fragments were even used decades later to educate engineers on the importance of safety culture. Challenger's legacy didn't end in the water. It lived on in every launch that followed. Families found space to grieve. Astronauts honored the crew in every briefing room, every simulation, every step onto the launch pad. And when the program eventually resumed, each mission carried the weight of that January morning. President Reagan's words still echo, "We will never forget them as they slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God." NASA's Day of Remembrance, held each year, honors Challenger, Columbia, Apollo 1, and all who lost their lives in exploration. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson captured the sentiment best. Every day we honor their legacy by taking the next giant leap, and by never forgetting the lessons written in tragedy. Across the country, from Kennedy Space Center to small local memorials, people still gather to remember. Flowers are laid, names are spoken, and for a moment, the noise of the world quiets. Yet even as NASA rebuilt, the world began asking harder questions, not just about how Challenger fell, but whether it ever should have been allowed to rise at all. Consequences, controversies, and the strain on America's space ambitions. The Challenger disaster didn't just tear apart a shuttle, it shook the foundation of America's most ambitious program. What followed wasn't simply an investigation, it was a national reckoning. NASA suddenly found itself under a microscope. Every decision, risk, and ignored warning dragged into the sunlight. And as the public searched for answers, the truth became tangled with outrage, political pressure, and a wave of conspiracy theories that refused to die. In the days after the explosion, NASA's image flipped almost overnight. The agency once celebrated as the pinnacle of American innovation now faced harsh questions. Why were engineers' warnings ignored? Why launch on one of the coldest Florida mornings on record? Why was the shuttle schedule treated like a TV timetable instead of a high-risk mission plan? It didn't take long for investigators to uncover what insiders had whispered about for years: a culture built on pressure. NASA had promised Congress, the White House, and the American public that the shuttle would be a reliable workhorse, capable of routine, almost airline-like missions. Delays weren't just inconvenient, they were expensive, embarrassing, and politically painful. Enter the Rogers Commission, the group tasked with dissecting the tragedy. What they found wasn't a single mistake, but a system on the brink. Communication chains that filtered out bad news. Managers overruling engineers. A shuttle program suffocating under schedule pressure. The conclusion hit like a hammer. The disaster wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a culture that had stopped listening. As NASA scrambled, the media sharpened its teeth. Investigators from the New York Times dug relentlessly, revealing memos, internal arguments, and warnings that had been pushed aside. The public was stunned, not just by the disaster, but by the idea that it may have been preventable. Gerald Mason's testimony to investigators became a flashpoint, an engineer reluctantly admitting that concerns were raised but never acted on. His words echoed everywhere, in newspapers, on the evening news, in living rooms across the country, and then came the term that would define NASA's greatest flaw: go fever. The idea that in the rush to launch, NASA convinced itself it was ready even when it wasn't. Suddenly, Challenger wasn't just a national tragedy. It became a symbol of how ambition can blind even the brightest institutions. But grief does strange things to the human mind, and when explanations arrive wrapped in technical jargon and bureaucratic language, some people look elsewhere. That's when the conspiracy theories began. At first, they were whispers on fringe radio shows and photocopied newsletters. Then the internet arrived, and a whole alternate version of Challenger's story exploded into the mainstream. According to these theories, the crew never died. In fact, some insist several of them never even boarded the shuttle. The stories get wilder. Francis Scobie, they say, is alive and well in Chicago as a CEO. Ellison Onizuka supposedly has a twin brother, Claude. Ronald McNair is said to have an older brother who looks suspiciously like him and shares his name's initials. Pilot Michael J. Smith apparently returned as a professor at the University of Wisconsin. Judith Resnick supposedly lives on as a Yale law professor. Krista McAuliffe allegedly teaches at Syracuse University under just her first name, Sharon. Only Gregory Jarvis escapes this fictional resurrection because no one could find a convincing look-alike. To believers, this is proof. To everyone else, it's a tragic misunderstanding of grief. Dr. Marta Marchlewska, a psychologist who studies conspiratorial thinking, summed it up with unsettling clarity, saying that some people simply cannot accept that random tragedy can strike good, ordinary heroes, so they rewrite the story into something less painful, even if it drifts far from reality. Conspiracy theorists even point to the Social Security Death Index, claiming there are no records of the astronauts' deaths, a claim debunked when journalists demonstrated entries for multiple crew members, and the theories only get darker. Some claim NASA staged the explosion to traumatize the nation, a collective shock designed to shape an entire generation. You can almost hear the YouTube comments writing themselves. But when experts counter these claims, they emphasize something far simpler and far more human. The truth is painful enough without inventing ghosts. Amid chaos, blame, and emotional fallout, NASA had a choice: either collapse under the weight of its failure or rebuild itself from the ground up. It chose the second path, slowly, painfully, honestly. Technical reforms came first: a redesigned booster system, new safety protocols, and an overhaul of the shuttle's most vulnerable components. But the deeper change came from within. NASA began confronting the cultural flaws that had grown unnoticed for years: communication barriers, managerial pressure, and a dangerous belief in its own invincibility. Training shifted, authority lines changed, engineers were encouraged, even required, to speak up, and recommendations from the Rogers Commission became non-negotiable. It took 32 months before NASA returned to flight with STS-26. When Discovery lifted off in 1988, it wasn't just another launch. It was NASA promising the world that Challenger would never be forgotten and never repeated. The Challenger disaster forced NASA and the world to confront uncomfortable truths: how little we truly understood, how much we chose not to see, and what lessons must never be forgotten. Decades later, Challenger remains more than a disaster. It is a compass, pointing toward responsibility, toward courage, toward the high cost of looking beyond our world. And as long as humanity keeps reaching upward, the legacy of the Challenger 7 rises with us. What's your take on this? Share your perspective in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.